Hi, and welcome to Organizational Leadership 3050, the second learning module of the course entitled Self in Context. This is Dr. Christine James. In this reflective seminar, what we're working on is the idea that you need to analyze past experiences, especially leadership experiences, that would have ended up influencing how you think about the world. And one of the most important aspects of understanding your leadership experience is to see how social influences and community relationships may end up shaping how you react as a leader or how you end up seeing yourself as a leader. So, for example, in Organizational Leadership 3000, we focus on you as an individual without the context involved yet. In 3050, we're starting to ask you to look at yourself in a broader context. So there's going to be a number of different ethical and theoretical frameworks that you may end up wanting to analyze your previous experience through. One of the things that we're going to do with you during the course is make sure that you have some background in specific theoretical frameworks for reflection. These theoretical frameworks come from scholars who have done work on reflective learning and on reflecting on your past leadership. That kind of scholarship is going to be very helpful for you as you go through the specific writing samples and assignments that you have to work with during our course. These 5 specific scholarly pieces are really the literature focus for the course. And one of the things that you're going to notice is that this literature focus is in common between Organizational Leadership 3000, 3050, and 4000. Those 1 credit hour seminars are all inspired by these 5 kinds of pieces of ways of looking theoretically at previous learning, at prior learning, at reflective learning. So when you're looking at the learning module content of our course, it comes from these individuals. And I'd like to especially make sure that you know that in this first learning module, the work of Fiedler and Marino and the work of Kolb will end up being some of the major material that we're going to be looking at. And Marino is somebody who actually helped in the development of this course, wonderful professor at DePaul University in Chicago, and her work is really groundbreaking in terms of reflective learning. So we've got some really good material for you to think about as you're looking for theoretical frameworks to understand your past learning experience. So first of all, let's take a little bit of a look at who these individuals are and how their work will end up influencing your discussion assignments during the course. It's important that you be able to analyze your past experiences using their theoretical frameworks. So remember what we mentioned in the first learning module, that you should look at your own past experience as a leader as if it's a case study. And those case studies need to be interpreted using theories. And a lot of the theories are going to have various phases that someone goes through as they develop as a leader. So the first time that you end up having to be a leader and train somebody on the job or make a difficult decision as a leader on the job, you may end up, not doing it as well as you will later on after you've had more experience. Those are the kinds of progress examples that we're looking at during the course. In Fiedler and Marino, what we're seeing is a way of describing and interpreting your own beliefs and making sure that you're paying some attention to the social, political, and environmental context that you're working in. Here we mean environment in the broad sense. We mean social interactions as well as the physical environment. So it's one of those things where you have to look at decisions that you've made in the past using that kind of a theoretical framework of, asking yourself what influenced me to think about the world in the way that I do, what ends up making me change my mind, what are the kinds of things that a leader should be responding to out of the context in which they live. When you're looking at a diagram like this, it's coming right out of the work of Fiedler and Marino, and what we're seeing is a specific listing, a category or a taxonomy of different kinds of reflection moments that you should go through as you're describing your past experience. What that means is that literally when you're answering the discussion questions during the course, you should try to pay attention to some of the questions that you see in this diagram, especially on the right side. When you're looking at what's getting your attention at first, it's kind of like that's that first moment of saying, okay, well, what was it that really drew my attention right away? Did it end up being important? Was it something that was a distraction? What ends up being salient in the event? What's important? What gives knowledge in the event? What kinds of things are interesting? What kinds of things get you curious? and then what kinds of emotions or feelings are being raised. And then as you look further down the listing, further down the taxonomy, you're going to end up seeing an emphasis on the idea of what's going to happen to the next event, the next time. Can you learn something that will influence how you interact with the world in a better way in the future? So part of the idea of being an effective leader is that you learn from your past experiences, and what the Fiddler and Marino diagram that you see here is giving you is a way of actually outlining and understanding the phases in reflection that you go through. So this is the kind of theoretical model that you would apply to a specific example from your own life that you're writing about. Here's another diagram that kind of explains it a little bit. What this should look like to you is a very complex feedback loop. Whenever you have an event, a specific experience, you end up going through this process where you think about what are you paying attention to, what different experiences have you had in the past that will influence how you reflect on it. And then when you're looking for meaningful learning, you end up needing to consider some of those ovals that you see at the bottom of the diagram. The significance of the event, the beliefs that you have, the feelings and emotions that go into the event. So this is just a different visual model. Instead of being a list, it gives you a visual representation of the different phases of reflection that you might have to go through. And that's a good way of thinking about it, the idea that there's a feedback loop, that every event that you have will be influenced in some way by previous experience, previous reflection that you did on that event, and that's what makes a good developing, self-transforming leader. When you're looking at the Fiddler and Marino material, it's good to compare it a little bit with what goes into the Kolb material. Those of you who had Organizational Leadership 3000 before 3050 may remember Kolb from before, but it's totally okay if you haven't had that course before. When you're looking at Kolb's material, he tells some very interesting ideas about the idea that you have different phases where you specialize your knowledge. So let's think a little bit about Kolb's models of self-reflection and kind of see them as another theoretical framework that you could use in describing your own work. When you look at this diagram from Kolb, it sort of looks like it's an upside-down cone of some sort. You want to think about yourself as moving up this diagram from the bottom of the screen up to the top, the direction that the arrow on the left side is going in, and that you as a self are transforming yourself through different experiences of learning and leadership that you have had. So as you are reflecting on these learning experiences, you're actually developing a more integrated understanding of who you are as a leader. Notice that down at the bottom on the right side, you see a depiction of yourself as undifferentiated, immersed in the world. So this is a self who is acquiring knowledge, but not really able to transform or understand the world better. Think about yourself maybe as a teenager. If you would have some particular experience that would really upset you, you may not have been able to fully verbalize how you felt. You might not have been able to react in a way that was positive. Maybe you ended up flying off the handle. Those are the kinds of things that an undifferentiated self would do, not quite yet a fully developed leader. In the next phase, moving up one, the idea of the self as content, interacting with the world. The idea that you can now reflect on yourself as interacting with the world. Maybe sometimes it goes well, maybe sometimes it doesn't. This is a phase where you're developing specialization, you're developing certain skills that you're getting better at. So maybe you've had your first job, maybe you are somebody who is gaining more and more work experience, and every so often you get called on to train someone who's new in your work field. That idea that you are developing certain specializations and that you have a way of understanding what your position is and that you could train somebody in how to do it if you needed to. That's one of the first steps in becoming a good leader and in becoming somebody who's able to reflect on their own processes. To explain how you do something on the job to someone else, you have to have had a moment of reflecting on it and thinking, okay, here's the process, here's what you do first, here's what you do next. Those are the kinds of things that Kolb is talking about. The final phase, the self as a process, transacting with the world, that means that you have a much more fluid and highly developed adaptability. Somebody who's a really good leader who knows multiple jobs, multiple ways of doing things. Somebody who you would imagine as being a really good manager who understands lots of different people who are working with them and lots of different tasks that are going on at the same time. That's the idea of having a transacting self, somebody who's really able to integrate many different kinds of knowledge. So Kolb's model is kind of handy. You can think about this as being a sort of metaphor or visual representation of development that you go through in your own life. Here's another Kolb diagram. This one is sort of based on the idea of what you're focusing on and when. How we end up having examples of knowledge where there are particular things that we might focus on or particular theories that we might be wedded to at a given moment, but then through specific examples of converging, assimilating other information, finding out what somebody else needs to do with that information, you kind of have a step back and you reflect on it and you gain more of an understanding of the bigger issue. That's the idea of having a manager who knows what a lot of different people working under them have to do and who understands many different points of view that are involved in the work environment that they're working in. That idea of somebody who's able to adapt and see a situation from multiple points of view, that's one of the hallmarks of a good leader. And by the process of reflecting on these examples from your own life during your organizational leadership reflective seminars, hopefully you're going to be able to gain some of that kind of adaptability. That's the kind of skill that we're hoping to help you develop. This is Kolb's big experiential learning table, and it's a table that's very complicated and it has lots of different parts, but it really is a great taxonomy that depicts those 3 different phases that we have been looking at so far. So if you remember in the other diagrams where you're first acquiring knowledge and then specializing and then being able to integrate and adapt your knowledge to new situations, that's what you see as you read this particular diagram from the left to the right. So those 3 columns that you see next to the labels on the left, those 3 columns correspond to the other diagrams that we've seen before, just breaking it down and giving you more of a vocabulary basis instead of a visual basis. Here's what you're going to be working on using those models from Marino and Fiedler and Kolb from this learning module. You're going to have 3 different discussion questions that you're going to post on. The first one is very autobiographical. We're going to ask you to think about an example of yourself as a member of a team, as a volunteer, as a member of a church group, even as a work experience, even as somebody who's in the military, somebody who's had the kind of experience of interacting with others in that kind of a context, where you had to work with others and you had to think about how they perceive the situation. How would you answer this kind of a question about your own self-development? How might you interact with people differently, using some inspiration from those Kolb and Fiedler Marino models that you've looked at in this learning module? Try to refer in your answer back to those particular modules. Think about yourself as going through those phases of acquisition, specialization, and then being able to integrate many different points of view. Here's another topic. Discussion 2 for this learning module. This is a case study discussion, and it's based on a real situation. Just imagine somebody, the name's been changed, John Reynolds, who's a research chemist in Alabama. He's very happy with his work as a chemist, and he also does good volunteer work, especially with Habitat for Humanity. While he is doing his volunteer work and being a chemist, he finds out that there are some serious questions about the vinyl siding that Habitat Humanity is using on their homes, that it may end up having certain negative effects in the environment, or it may have certain negative effects on people's health. And we want to try and, have a look at this kind of a situation and think, well, what are the different phases that John Reynolds would have to go through as he's dealing with this question? How is he going to be acquiring knowledge? How is his specialized knowledge going to influence how he sees the situation? And then how can he try to integrate different perspectives and different needs of different people as he's dealing with whether he should continue as a volunteer with Habitat for Humanity, or whether he needs to in some way be a whistleblower and tell somebody about what's going on with the vinyl. So it's an important kind of a case study for you to think about, sort of put yourself in John Reynolds' position and then think about the different phases of Kolb and Fiedler and Marino that he's working with. The third example is a discussion that's a real historical example. You may be familiar with the story of the Marshall Islands. It's a place that became famous as a nuclear warhead testing zone, especially after World War II. Lots of people very concerned with defense, wanting to make sure that we had good weaponry. It turned out that there were a variety of negative health effects for the people who were the people living in the Marshall Islands already, those who are indigenous to the area, then if you look at that kind of an example, there's lots of different people who the individual working with the Department of Defense is going to have to, answer to. How do you end up balancing out the needs of the military, the needs of the government to have security, with the questions about the health, the environmental effects, the people who will be affected by the use of these particular testing sites? So when you're looking at this, remember again the idea of the Kolb and Fiedler-Marino models for reflection. How is it that someone in this kind of a situation can go through those 3 different phases that we've looked at in this learning module? How would you see them trying to resolve this situation using those different models for reflection?